Okay, we're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome everyone to the ISO 9001-2015 Preparing for a Successful Transition webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski and I am the Technical Director of Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everybody. All participants are on mute, but we do want to answer your questions, so please make use of the question section on the dashboard, and we will answer your questions at the conclusion of today's presentation. Our topics for today are as follows. We're going to have a brief review of where the standards come from, a discussion on why the changes were so dramatic this time around. We'll have an update on the timeline for transition. We're going to do a deep dive on the key changes. We're going to answer what I suspect is a key question for many of you, and that is, do you have to overhaul your current system? We've got some FAQs from past presentations. Perhaps some of your questions will be answered there. A few final points, and then, as promised, your questions. Any standard that is titled ISO means that it is a publication of the International Organization for Standardization based in Geneva, Switzerland. And who they are is a collective. They're an international collective. They're made up of numerous international members. Now, each of the standards that ISO publishes is assigned what's referred to as a technical committee, or TC, for authorship and interpretations and so forth. Now, the technical committee that was specifically assigned to ISO 9001 is TC 176. Now, TC 176 itself also includes members from each of the major industrialized nations. Now, the U.S. representatives to TC 176 and to the ISO at large are the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. Now, as to why the changes were so dramatic on this new standard, a couple of reasons. First of all, the ISO recognized that the industries that use ISO 9001 have evolved. They've changed, and they're going to continue to evolve and change. And this is owing, of course, to new technologies in the markets that use ISO 9001, new expectations from client bases, and so forth. Also, obviously, the ISO wants to see ISO 9001 continue to grow in terms of who's utilizing it. Different sectors, different industries, they want to see it continue to make an impact in the world at large. They made an effort on this particular rewrite to simplify some of the language that was used to try to help aid in understanding and promoting of consistency between auditors, certification bodies, etc. And perhaps most importantly, it was recognized that for a number of companies, there is a desire to have better cross-compatibility between standards. There are companies out there that have 2, 3, in some cases 4 or more certifications, and previously what this often meant was you had to have multiple sets of documentation, multiple systems really, for ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and so forth. So with this latest edition, there has been some work targeted at improving cross-compatibility and hopefully making it an easier road for companies that wish to have multiple certifications. Nigel Croft, who is the TC 176 chairperson, he was asked during the development process for ISO 9001, towards the end of the process actually, what were some of the key things that they were trying to accomplish with the rewrite on the standard. And he expressed 3 key features that he wanted, that the committee at large wanted to have the new standard promote. First, the whole idea of process approach. And processes, of course, have been a part of quality management systems now for some time. And this is, of course, recognized not just at the system level, but at management level. The whole idea that processes should be results-oriented, that we should seek consistency in what we're doing, and so forth. Now, that idea segues very much into the next key feature, and that is Plan, Do, Check, Act. Plan, Do, Check, Act is also a very long tenured idea. It goes all the way back to the 2000 version of ISO 9001. And again, very similar idea, the whole idea that we plan out what we're going to do. We have controls in place. We have mechanisms to check outputs. We have mechanisms to react to what we've learned from the checking process, and so forth. These are all things that we strive for and want to see in place for the systems that use ISO 9001. The new idea, the new feature, and really it wasn't such a new idea, was risk-based thinking, preventing undesirable outcomes, and what that means in a larger sense for the organizations that use ISO 9001. We've got some in-depth discussion on risk-based thinking later in our presentation today. Now, obviously, process approach and Plan, Do, Check, Act, as I said, these are tenured ideas. They've been around since the 2000 version of ISO 9001. Risk-based thinking is the new, but then again, not so new idea that's being promoted by the standard. Let's take a fresh look at our timeline for transition, get a sense of where we've been and also where we're going. Now, the development of the standard, you may be surprised to learn, goes all the way back to early 2013, and it was tied to the publication of an item called Annex SL. We'll be learning a little bit about that in just a bit. The committee draft of the standard was published in June of that year, June of 2013. Now, that document had a fairly limited distribution, pretty much just committee members and anybody that the committee felt it was important to include in that very early stage. Now, the initial document that was made available to the public was the draft standard, the draft international standard, which was published in May of 2014. It was interesting at the time, that document actually included all of the definitions that would later be part of the ISO 9000 standard. So when we got a look at the DIS standard, one of the first things we noticed about it was what a long document it was. But that, of course, changed as we saw the final draft standard, which was published in July of last year. Now, the final draft standard represented roughly 98% or perhaps even more of what we saw in the actual standard, which was published a short couple of months later in September. So the official standard as we have it now was published in September of 2015. That leaves one critical date yet to come, and that is September of 2018, and that is when all ISO 9001-2008 clients will need to have completed their transition to the new standard, because ISO 9001-2008 will cease to be a relevant standard, and it will be a footnote. And so we have our new standard. It was officially published on September 15th of 2015. It is available for purchase directly from the ISO. It represents the culmination of nearly 3.5 years of work, going all the way back to the issuance of Annex SL in 2012. And as I said, we've got a few more points on Annex SL in just a minute here. The clock is indeed ticking on ISO 9001-2008. By virtue of that publication date, September 15th, 2015, the official cutoff for 9001-2008 has been established as September 14th, 2018. Now, PJR, for our part, we have established our own cutoff on 9001-2008 auditing. That's outlined to an extent in the FAQ document available on our website. We've also prepared a more detailed client memorandum with some details on how we're going to handle the transition process. If you'd like a copy of that memorandum, please inquire with your salesperson or scheduler. Back in May of last year, we met and discussed what additional audit time was going to be needed. We concluded that for most of our clients, a minimal amount of time would be sufficient. We will advise each of you on a case-by-case basis what the additional time will be. And again, we do have that memorandum memo for you if you so desire. Getting into what the key changes are. Any discussion of ISO 9001 2015 really has to begin with an exploration of Annex SL. Now, Annex SL has been called the high-level outline, Annex XL. It is, as the name would imply, an annex. It's part of a larger ISO publication called Directives Part 1 Consolidated'iso Supplement. Now, Directives Part 1 you can think of as a standard on how to write standards. It's a self-imposed item that the ISO uses, and they have, within Directives Part 1, all of those steps are discussed: issuing a committee draft, issuing a draft standard, issuing a final draft standard, what to do, voting procedures, and things of this nature. If you are interested, Directives Part 1 can be read in its entirety. I've provided a link here. Now, it's not really pertinent to an organization running a system that's certified to ISO 9001, but if you're curious how these standards get developed, the Directives Part 1 can be viewed at the link below. Annex SL itself was written back in 2012. It represented the output of a special committee on the ISO called the Joint Technical Coordination Group, or JTCG. And what Annex SL is, it's a 10-section blueprint for authoring the ISO family of standards. Now, it promotes a number of things: common terms and core definitions, common sections. It's all 10 of those sections. The plan by the end of this year or towards the end of next year is that all of the ISO family of standards will follow this 10-section structure. And even some of the core verbiage will be exactly the same. So, for example, we have a new term, interested party. This is a term that's going to be used in all of the ISO family of standards. A term like customer, a term like organization. These are terms that should mean the same thing going from one standard to the next. And now, because we have this Annex SL core structure, now they will mean the same thing going from standard to standard. And it's through Annex SL that an organization is going to be able to add multiple certifications with relative ease if that's what they're seeking to do. So, for example, if a company has ISO 9001 and they are looking to add ISO 14001, they can then implement the additional requirements and have a common structure to their system and have it be minimally obtrusive to what they're doing. So what is the 10-section structure? Well, let's take a preliminary look at it and get a sense of what's where. Sections 1, 2, and 3 are called Scope, Normative Reference, and Terms and Definitions. Now, these are the exact same 3 sections that appear in ISO 9001-2008. And as before, these are non-auditable sections. We're actually going to be exploring what's in these items in just a little bit. Now, the auditable portion of the standard begins in Section 4. Section 4 is called Context of the Organization. And there's a couple of key items here that an organization has to consider. What is the organization? What is its context? Who are its interested parties? What is the scope of the system? What are the processes that make up this quality system? In Section 5, we have the key new term, leadership. This is a very important term. We're going to be exploring that in just a bit. We've got some familiar items here. Customer focus is here. Policy, quality policy is here. Roles, responsibilities, and authorities are discussed here. In Section 6, planning, we have the primary placeholder for the risk requirements. This is also where quality objectives has been placed. There's been some expansion on quality objectives. Also a general section on planning of changes. And then Section 7 is called support. Again, a lot of familiar items here. Competence is here, communication. We have this new term, documented information. This is taken to include both document requirements and record requirements. We'll be exploring what that means in just a bit. Section 7, you should also be aware, is the placeholder for the calibration requirements. Measurement equipment requirements are found in Section 7. So taking these first 4 sections together, context, leadership, planning, and support, these 4 items taken together really represent a foundation to be built on in terms of what are the basic requirements that we need for a quality system. What do we build on with this quality system? Section 8, operation, is an interesting requirement, and you can think of Section 8 as what are the day-to-day operations for an organization? What does it have to do day-to-day to accomplish its mission? And the items that are here are presented in a logical order. We have requirements for products and services. This is going to include interactions with customers, designing the products. We have this new terminology, externally provided processes, products, and services. You might remember that was formerly called purchasing. Production and service provision. How do we control the execution of our core activity? How do we make sure that the product is made consistently, and so forth? So in Section 8, we have what you might call day-to-day operations. That in turn gives way to Sections 9 and 10. And 9 and 10 really are very much shared ideas. In Section 9, performance evaluation, we have, again, some very familiar content. We have management review here. Internal audit is here. This is the placeholder for customer satisfaction data. And then in Section 10, improvement, we have corrective action, nonconformity control, continual improvement, and so forth. So again, the standard itself deliberately follows a plan, do, check, act type methodology. You can think of sections 4 through 7 really as planning, Section 8 kind of as the doing, Section 9 as the checking, and Section 10 as the acting. And that's very deliberate. Now, as to the key changes, what are the primary new content areas represented by 9001-2015? Well, obviously, risk is a huge part of any discussion. And it's important to recognize what the intent was with risk and what they were going for in terms of how it was put across. I think for a lot of organizations, risk is something that was viewed as projects that are done in a condensed amount of time. We put them aside, and then we go about our day-to-day business. And the writers of the standard, the TC 176 committee, and really the ISO at large, because this is part of Annex SL itself, want you to think of risk as a system-wide strategy. To begin with, the term risk is used 16 times in the auditable portion of the standard. It is everywhere in the new standard, and it's something that you need to think as it affects the existing processes that you have. Now, to draw a parallel, if you go back to when the ISO 9001-2000 standard was published, the new idea at that time was continual improvement. And how do we demonstrate that our processes are improving over time? Well, again, it wasn't a case of you had a set of activities that you do 2 days a month and then put aside. It's system-wide. And accordingly, what they've said is because this is something that's looked at system-wide, affecting all processes, they have indicated, and it's even been written into the standard, and I'm going to point out where a little bit later in our presentation, you are not required to have a formal documented risk management process. That is crucial. It's something that impacts your current processes. There is no expectation that it be a standalone process on its own. So again, the idea is that we have risk aversion in all of the various areas of our quality management system. So let's take a look at the core text as it's presented in the standard itself. And again, for this, we look to Section 6 and specifically Section 6.1. And there's 2 subclauses. Here is subclause 1. When you're planning for the system, you need to consider the issues that are referred to in 4.1 and the requirements that are referred to in 4.2. Now let's talk about those 2 clausal references. When they're talking about issues referred to in 4.1, that goes all the way back to context of the organization, and within context it talks about both internal and external issues. So they want you to take a very global perspective on where those issues might be coming from. And then requirements, and the clausal reference here, requirements 4.2, this is referring to interested parties. And again, external interested parties and internal interested parties. And what do? You determine the risks and opportunities. And again, more key verbiage here, because you'll note that they're using both terms, risks and opportunities. And what do they mean by opportunities? Well, again, if you dig down into the verbiage, you'll see it's not just, I like to use this phrase, it's not just that we're trying to avoid bad stuff, we're trying to make sure that when good stuff happens that we take advantage of it. So you'll note subclause B talks about enhancing desirable effects. That's where opportunities come in. And then, of course, preventing or reducing undesirable effects. So this is kind of a 2-part item here. Even though the term that's been applied to it is risk-based thinking, the larger picture is, what can we do not just to avoid bad stuff, but to also drive improvement in our quality system. So determine these risks, determine these opportunities, give assurance that your system can do what it needs to do, reduce undesired effects, but also enhance desirable effects, and then overall achieve improvement. Now, subclause 2 under 6.1 reads as follows. You need to plan the actions to address those risks and opportunities. And then you need to also figure out how to integrate and implement those actions. Again, this is key into the quality management system processes. So again, they're not saying have a risk management process. They're saying integrate risk-based thinking into your existing processes, and then evaluate the effectiveness of what you're doing. And then they say that actions that you take to address risks and opportunities, they need to be proportionate to the potential impact. So in other words, prioritize based on what's going to give you the bang for your buck, obviously recognizing that you can't devote a multitude of resources to every single risk-based thinking type action that you take. Now, in terms of tying together risk-based thinking / risk management to what you're already doing under ISO 9001-2008, we've identified 4 areas where there's a real nice correlation. There's a real direct tie-in. Let's go over those now. Management review, clause 5.6. You're looking at your overall system and you're already targeting improvement efforts. That's absolutely risk-based thinking. Section 722, reviewing requirements related to the product. This is the, for a lot of companies, this is the contract review phase. You're assessing what your customers' expectations are against what your current capabilities are. And you're taking steps to resolve discrepancies. That's absolutely risk-based thinking. Training, section 622. You're assessing what your competency needs are and taking steps to ensure that your personnel are qualified and competent. Absolutely risk-based thinking. And then most directly, most obviously, preventive action. Assessing potential problems and taking actions to avoid those problems in the first place. Let's continue now with an exploration of some key changes in terminology. The terms procedures, records, and documents have all been eliminated and replaced with a more collective term, documented information. Now, there's an annex in the standard, Annex A6, which provides an important clarification, and that is on the terms maintain and retain. And so, anytime you read the following phrase in the standard, maintain documented information, that is generally understood as a replacement for past references to document, procedure, or quality manual. Now, one good example of this is in clause 4.3, where it requires that the scope of the system be documented. Now, there's only a handful of these maintain documented information requirements in the standard. However, there are numerous retained documented information requirements. Those are generally understood as replacements for past references to records. Now, examples of required retained documents include clause 933, which requires that records of management review be retained. So again, maintain documented information and retained documented information. It's important to look for those phrases. All references to product now read as products and services. Now, this has been the case for quite some time. If you read Clause 3 of ISO 9001-2008, it stated, wherever the term product appears, it can also mean service. So they're trying to be more inclusive. They want to recognize that there are numbers of ISO certified companies without a tangible product. Management responsibility has become leadership. And there's a number of things that they're trying to accomplish with the larger idea of leadership. The whole idea that management leads by example and involvement rather than simply directing that activities be performed. Continual improvement is now part of a larger section simply called improvement. And the idea here is that continual improvement is not the only aspect of improvement that can be strived for. Obviously, we can have improvement in other ways. You can have reactive changes, you can have breakthroughs, And it's not fair not to recognize those items as improvements to the quality system. So continual improvement is still very much present, but it's now part of a much larger picture for the whole idea of improvement. Suppliers are now referred to as external providers. Now this was a couple of ideas here. One, again, to better accommodate service organizations, but also to bring together some like-minded ideas. Now again, we have an annex clause to refer to. External providers are taken to mean not just outside suppliers, but also associate companies and any outsourcing that's done. Now in ISO 9001-2008, we had separate requirements for interacting with subcontractors and with suppliers, the difference between outsourcing and more traditional purchasing. Well, in ISO 9001-2015, those ideas have been merged, and they've all been pulled together under this larger umbrella term, external provider control. So again, trying to present a more unified picture on how we control those types of activities. There's been some elimination of required content. Now this, I suspect, is something you've already been told about. ISO 9001-2015 does not specifically require any of the following. They don't require a quality manual, they don't require procedures, and they don't require work instructions. Now, in terms of what this means for you as an organization, one of the key things about this standard, and frankly, this was true under ISO 9001-2008 as well, what has been required since the standard was first published is consistency and effectiveness, and more specifically, consistency and effectiveness of your processes. So for a number of companies, procedures and quality manuals and things of this nature were a means to achieve this consistency. For a number of other companies, the procedures were burdensome. They were fluff, and they really didn't have anything to do with ensuring that their processes were consistent and effective. For those types of companies, this change is going to be particularly helpful because you'll be able to point to whatever process controls you have in place and say, look, I don't have to have procedures anymore. I have other means of controlling my processes. Now, I will hasten to add that if you choose to have procedures, it's absolutely going to be acceptable. You just have to abide by them. But as auditors, we can't specifically demand that you have them anymore. The term management representative has been eliminated from the standard. Now, the implication here is a little bit more complicated. The responsibility for managing the system is still very much present. The writing of the standard says that the leadership team needs to ensure that the management system is effectively taken care of. They say that you need to assign responsibilities. But it also says, and this is key, that management has to be accountable for the effectiveness of the system. So our interpretation of that is multiple things are important here. Number one, it's no longer going to be acceptable for the leadership team to distance itself from the quality system and say that the management representative is solely responsible for the system. Frankly, that wasn't an acceptable arrangement to begin with in practice. Leadership was always expected to be involved. Now they've kind of forced leadership's hand with the rewrite of the standard. Now, on another key point I want to make here, the leadership is absolutely allowed to nominate an individual. They're absolutely allowed to nominate an individual and say, okay, you need to be the point of contact for the auditors and so forth, that's completely acceptable. But we need to be able to confirm that leadership is taking an active role in the quality system and making themselves accountable. That's kind of the key aspect of this change. The term permissible exclusions has been removed from the standard. Now, our read on that is it's not going to be terribly different from the current arrangement. The way that it's been written into the standard now, you'll be able to claim any item from ISO 9001:2015 as non-applicable. Now what that means is that the validity of those designations is going to be verified at each audit, which is what we do now. The only key difference here is the terminology, and then also the fact that it's now open to the entire standard. Now that being said, we've reviewed this requirement, and our feeling is that anything outside of sections 7 and 8 being claimed for exemption is going to be highly suspect. You still need to demonstrate that your system fulfills all of the applicable requirements of the standard, and anything outside of 7 or 8 is going to be difficult to substantiate. We mentioned this a bit earlier in the presentation. 9001:2015 includes a new term from Annex SL that is intended to be applicable, and that is interested parties. Let's take a look at the definition for interested parties. A person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. Now the examples that are given include customers, owners, people within the organization, and then also suppliers, bankers, unions, partners, even competitors. This is a very broad term, and it's deliberately broad. And you'll note, again, the whole aspect of internal and external. Now, really, in practice, this was intended all along. You know, as an organization, when you plan a decision, when you plan an activity, you know, it's good business to consider who might be affected by that decision. The standard is introducing this term kind of to broaden the scope of who you're going to consider might be affected by your decisions as an organization. Now, I want to point out additionally, very, very important, in clause 4.2, it says that as an organization, you need to determine who your interested parties are, but it emphasizes who are the interested parties that are relevant to your quality management system. This aspect of relevancy is key. So as an organization, you know, if you ascertain that these interested parties are relevant and these interested parties are not, so long as you have a basis for explaining that to the auditors, that is going to be considered and likely accepted. You know, you have to have a basis for explaining relevancy in the context of interested parties. Okay, let's continue now and look at some key new questions that are posed by the standard. We're going to kind of do this on a section-by-section basis. Starting with section 4. What is the purpose of this organization? Who are its interested parties? Does any part of the standard qualify for a non-applicable designation? In section 5, do we have a leadership structure? Has leadership made itself accountable for the effectiveness of the system? Are the quality policy and objectives consistent with the strategic direction of the company? Has the quality policy been made available to all interested parties? Has the quality management system been integrated into business activities? Now, please note that this does not mean that your financial records are going to be subject to audit. I know there's been some concern over this whole aspect of business processes. It does not mean that we're going to be digging into your financial records whatsoever. Section 6, have you considered the risks and opportunities? Have you taken appropriate actions for said risks and opportunities? On the subject of quality objectives, who's responsible? What is the target date? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And are they relevant to the conformity of products and enhancement of customer satisfaction? Now in Section 7, the key new idea is organizational knowledge. This is knowledge that's gained through experience. Do we have mechanisms in place to retain organizational knowledge? And have we looked at our competency base and determined what's going to be needed for the future? Now, beyond organizational knowledge, there is really nothing in Section 7 that hasn't been present in some form already in 9001-2008. And that's also true for Section 8. Looking at Section 8, clause by clause, really there is no significant new content that wasn't present in some form already in 9001-2008. And that's also true for Section 9. In Section 9, we have a lot of familiar content from ISO 9001-2008, Section 8. It's also now where the management review requirement can be found. And that's also true for Section 10. No significant new content that was not present in some form already in 9001-2008. So as you have hopefully seen, the changes to the standard are minimal and manageable. Really, the new idea of risk, as I've said a few times now, is not so new, especially if you consider the fact that preventive action has been a part of the 9001 standard since it was first published. What I'd like to do now, over the next several slides, I want to give you a cover-to-cover analysis of the content of the standard and just kind of show you what's where and what these various sections are for, and give you a sense of using the standard and really getting maximum benefit from how it was written. Now the standard begins with Section 0.1, which is a general section. It provides an overview statement, some ideas on who the standard benefits, talks about risk-based thinking, talks about plan, do, check, act, and it explains 4 key new terms, 3 of which are getting their first official definitions. Shall, which of course is a mandatory requirement, numerous instances within the standard. Anytime the standard says the organization shall, that indicates a mandatory requirement. Should, which represents a recommendation. Now there are actually no uses of the term should within the auditable portion of the standard. May, which represents a permission. That term actually appears once in the auditable content. And then can, which represents a possibility or capability, can mean, and so forth. Numerous instances in this case. Section 0.2 includes a listing of the 7 quality management principles. Now these are virtually the same as the 8 quality management principles that were available before. Section 0.3, process approach, reinforcement of the process approach, and also an improved graphic showing the correlation between the sections of the standard and the PDCA cycle. 033, risk-based thinking, a definition and explanation of the importance of the term. Section 0.4, the interrelationship between the management system standards. This is 9000 and 9004. Here's our explanation of sections 1, 2, and 3. Section 1 is called scope. It's some general verbiage pertaining to the applicability of ISO 9001. Section 2 is normative reference. It establishes the linkage to ISO 9000 for all official terms and definitions. And then Section 3, terms and definitions, which interestingly is without content at the moment. It's possible that Section 3 will be used as a future placeholder for ISO 9001 specific definitions. But at the moment, There are no 9001 specific definitions. We've already gone over sections 4 through 10, so let's dive into Annex A. Now, in terms of non-auditable content, I believe that Annex A is going to be the most beneficial portion of the standard for the certified companies. There's a lot of really quite helpful items in here, things that are going to help you in terms of implementation of the standard. Let's begin with A1, structure and terminology. Now this item reinforces a critical doctrine, and that is that you do not have to align your documentation to match ISO 9001-2008. Additionally, you don't have to use the specific terms from the standard. So for example, if you are comfortable calling them suppliers, there's no reason that you have to suddenly start calling them external providers. If you are comfortable calling them records, there's no reason you suddenly have to start referring to them as retained documented information. So familiar terminology is absolutely permitted to continue to be used within your quality system. Section A2 is called Products and Services. A little bit fuller explanation of intent on the changing of all references to product to read products and services. Section A3, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. We had a look at this earlier. Gives a more full explanation on the intent in the identification of interested parties. Section A4, risk-based thinking. This is an extensive section that's intended to help you understand the concept, and this is where it's officially emphasized that a formal structure and process for risk management is not required. Section A5, applicability, discusses the logic for removing exclusions from the standard and gives some further discussion on non-applicables. We looked at A6 earlier, documented information. This is our discussion on the terms maintained documented information and retained documented information. A7, organizational knowledge, gives a further explanation on competency and ongoing competency and the challenges that an organization might face, including the loss of long-time employees. And then finally, A8, control of externally provided products and services. And again, we looked at this one earlier as well, and both an explanation of the phrase and some suggestions on who it applies to. Annex B is an extensive discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and several other publications, including 9004, 10001, and so forth. And then finally, the standard concludes with a bibliography. Now, as to whether or not you have to overhaul your current system, hopefully we have made it clear that you do not have to overhaul your current system. One of the goals that TC 176 had was to improve the inclusiveness of the standard. Now, if you go and tell over 1 million worldwide certified companies that they have to overhaul their system, that's not inclusive. So what does that mean in terms of the practical aspects of your system? If your quality manual fits your business, you can absolutely keep it. If your procedures are effective at defining your processes and how they operate, absolutely keep those procedures. If your quality policy, if your quality objectives and so forth are all well known, all adding value, absolutely keep those as well. Let's have a look now at some FAQs that have come up in past offerings of this training and what the answers were to those questions. Will our staff have to complete transition training? This is going to depend a bit on the extent of revisions that you make to your system. If you end up overhauling your system because you feel it's beneficial to do so, well then the amount of transition training is going to be quite a bit more. At a minimum, you will be expected to provide transition awareness. In other words, you'll need to be able to demonstrate that you have made your staff aware that there is a new standard, and you've made some assessment of the impact of the new standard on those people's processes. Now, it's entirely conceivable that for the majority of your staff, there will be no effect whatsoever in transitioning from 9001-2008 to 9001-2015. Certainly, for anybody in a production type role, people running CNC machines, driving forklifts, and so forth, these individuals are going to likely feel almost no effect whatsoever. But of course, this will vary from case to case. Now, what about internal auditors? Do internal auditors have to go through transitional training? We're actually getting this question a lot here at PJR. What you have to remember about internal auditing is that internal auditing is just one of many competencies that your organization needs to plan for. And again, in terms of what it means to be competent for one or more roles within the quality system, that is your call as the organization. This is your system after all. So it's up to you to decide how much transition training is going to be needed. Now, another key point that I want to make. Remember that just because the standard is changing doesn't necessarily mean that your processes are being dramatically changed. These are still your processes, and therefore the internal auditors are still going to be auditing your processes. So if you have a seasoned team of internal auditors, it's entirely conceivable that these folks could do a period of self-study and successfully transition to auditing ISO 9001:2015. Now, as has always been the case, we will be judging the competency of your internal auditors by the overall effectiveness of the internal audit process. So in other words, if PJR comes in and we are finding all kinds of issues in your system, potentially that's going to raise questions on how effective your internal audit process is. Not always, but potentially. We are also getting lots of questions on the updates to some of the other standards, in particular the standards for the aerospace and automotive industry. We do know that all of the major sector-specific standards, that is TS 16949, AS 9100, and TL 9000, they've all indicated their intention to transition and continue alignment with ISO 9001. All three have indicated 2016 is their targeted publication date. We don't have a firm publication date for any one of those three standards at this time. We will absolutely pass that along as soon as we have one. We do have a new version of ISO 13485, that is the medical device standard. That item was published back in March, but interestingly, it was written to align with ISO 9001-2008. Now, we will be providing some future updates on ISO 13485-2016 very soon. As to whether you should get certified now or wait, we have a lot of people that come to us that are at various stages of implementing a quality management system, some of which have invested more than a year in implementing their quality system. So when they started, the standard of note was still ISO 9001-2008. So of course, those kinds of companies are wondering, well, is there still value for me in pursuing 9001-2008, or should I just make the jump to 9001-2015? Well, obviously, PJR can't make that decision for you, but we do want to emphasize a couple of key points. First of all, 9001-2008 still has 2.5 years, just under 2.5 years of usability left in it. It's not going to be an irrelevant standard until we get to September of 2018. Also, bear in mind that the early audits to ISO 9001:2015 are going to be difficult. It's a new standard, not just for you, but for us as well. So do you really want to be at the front of the line with a new system and kind of being the front of the line, and the auditors are still getting used to auditing this new standard? So obviously, as time goes by, the auditing of 9001:2015 is going to get a lot smoother, but can you transition now? Absolutely. Can you still certify to 9001:2008? Absolutely. In terms of steps that you can take right now to plan out your transition process appropriately, we do like to emphasize the 7-step process that's promoted by the IAF ID9. This is an informative document from the International Accreditation Forum, and it recommends a 7-step process. Number 1, a full review of 9001:2015 performed by top management to identify any gaps. Number 2, a plan of implementation with assigned responsibilities. Number 3, an update of applicable documentation. Step 4, providing necessary awareness and transition training to your staff. Step 5, an internal audit, a full system internal audit followed by a management review. Step 6, corrective action for all internal audit findings in process or complete. And then finally, Step 7, coordination with PJR for planning of transition arrangements. I do want to make one final emphasis on the documentation transition. Remember that your documentation has to work for you first and foremost. If a renumbering enables the documentation to work better for you, then so much the better, but it will not be required. We will also want to encourage you to work with your auditors. For many of you, you have had relationships with the same auditor for a number of years. They know your system. They've been taught about the new standard. They're going to be an invaluable resource for you in your transition process. PJR feels this is an exciting time for quality system certification. The 2015 version of ISO 9001 is a beneficial update to a standard with a long track record of contribution to the world. We are going to continue to provide timely updates on the transition process, and we will endeavor to ensure our clients have a smooth transition. Quick update on the support standards. ISO 9000:2015 was published on September 15th, 2015, and it is also available to purchase direct from the ISO. This is, of course, the fundamentals and vocabulary document. It contains all sanction definitions, the 7 quality management principles, and a series of concept diagrams showing the intended interrelationship of ideas. As before, ISO 9000 is not a certifiable standard, and you are not required to have a copy of it to achieve ISO 9001 certification. ISO 9004 and ISO 19011 both remain at their current revisions for the time being. 9004, we've been told, is very likely going to be updated. 19011 is also very likely going to be updated. As they are both ISO standards, they would have to align with the Annex SL framework, but at the present time, they remain at their current revisions. We have a couple of additional resources we'd like to make you aware of. We have prepared a side-by-side comparison between ISO 9001:2008 and ISO 9001:2015. And we've also prepared a FAQ report highlighting key questions and answers. These are both available on our website at www.pjr.com. I'd also like to invite you to join me for one of my other webinars. I have a webinar called ISO 9001-2015, Critical Points of Review During the Transition Audit Process. This is a deep dive into the new content of ISO 9001-2015 and an assessment on how it will be reviewed during the transition audit itself. I also have a presentation called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. This is also shown once monthly. This is an exploration of the critical topic of processes and how to correctly understand them. Finally, I would like to invite you to keep in touch. We do have an opt-in feature on our website. If you go to www.pjr.com, at the bottom of the page, enter your email address and click subscribe, you will be automatically entered for automatic updates on standards, publications, and other points of interest. I do thank you for your attention today. I'm going to go ahead and open the question dashboard and see what kinds of questions we have at the moment. Okay, we have a question from Chuck Mack asking, where does the term may appear in the standard that is auditable? Chuck, you'll have to excuse me. I do not have that just at the moment, but I will endeavor to get some kind of answer to you. Okay. Are there any other questions today? Branko Lobo asks, preventive action is not mentioned anymore in the 2015 standard. Why? Well, Branko, the larger idea with preventive action was that the whole idea of risk-based thinking and preventing undesirable outcomes was something that was intended to affect the whole quality system, the standard at large, and therefore to have a section called preventive action gives the impression that this is something that's finite, something that we have in one space, and that's all you have to concern yourself with. Preventive action is best viewed as a larger strategy for achieving risk-based thinking. So it's not mentioned in the standard, but the idea is still very much present. Okay, we have a question from Margie Hensley. Currently, we comply with ISO 9001-2005 as an analytical laboratory. Will be required to comply with ISO 9001-2015. Margie, perhaps you mean ISO 9001-2008. ISO 9001-2005 is not a standard that I'm familiar with. In terms of will you be required to comply with it, if by comply you mean that you abide by it but you are not certified to it, that is a matter for you to determine internally, and also what are the expectations of your customers and other interested parties. If you are officially certified to 9001-2008, you will have to complete a transition no later than September of 2018. Ronnie Al-Zubaydai, and I do hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do we still require to document process interaction? Yes, absolutely. You are required to determine how your processes interact, and you have to be prepared to demonstrate that interaction. That is absolutely still a requirement. Okay. Anastasia Varty asks, how much time will be required for the transition period for a medium-sized company up to 100 employees? Anastasia, that is a question that should be directed to either your scheduler or salesperson. We would definitely prepare some information for you for your specific company. Okay, we have a question from Angela Doa. Is there a separate audit for transition, or is this part of an annual/research audit? It would be part of either your surveillance audit or recertification audit. Hussein Hafour asks, what are the mandatory documents? If by mandatory documents you mean mandatory maintained documented information, there are a couple of items that are mandatory. You have to have your quality policy be documented. You have to have the scope of your system be officially documented, including any non-applicable items. There's a handful of others. I do not have those committed to memory. You would have to refer to the standard itself. Okay, Dawn Ives asks, when the automotive standard is released, will an extension certification be authorized since it includes ISO 9001:2015? Dawn, I believe the correct answer to your question is in terms of an extension certification, TS 16949 at present is a separate certification from ISO 9001. That will continue to be the case with the new version of TS 16949. Linda Jones asks, since Perry Johnson is a registrar, can you give a list of consultants that could assist with gap analysis for transition? Linda, that's not something that I can personally provide, but again, potentially you might be able to work with your salesperson from PJR if they have some suggestions on a consulting resource. Okay, Hussein Hafour with a follow-up question, how to find mandatory document requirements. Again, you need to look for the phrase maintained as documented information or maintain documented information within the standard. That's the key for finding the document requirements. Any further questions today? Okay, I'll wish all of you a good day, and thank you for your attention.